This is an interview with David Ruebain, current PVC of Diversity, Equality and Inclusion at the University of Sussex. He's the first person to fill this role at our university, and he certainly has a CV for it. He's consulted and advised on equality, diversity and inclusion for many years, primarily in higher education, but also in the FA Premier League. I first spoke to David in November 2021 when I sent him an email shortly after he got the position. He invited me to his office for coffee, and we spent an hour talking about his important position and him listening to my impression of my time here. Having now had the chance to interview him for this series, I'm happy to say that I found him down to earth, forthcoming, and having a clear expertise in his area. We talk about what his current role involves and his approach, how he's found working at the university in comparison with previous institutions, the ethos of Sussex as disruptive by design, and his perspective on finding the good in people. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Now, without further ado, my conversation with David Ruebain. Hi David, it's a pleasure to have you on today.
Thanks very much, Jethro, and thanks for inviting me.
So you're the first person to be given this new role as the PVC of Culture, Diversity and Inclusion. I think you can give me an idea of what the role is about and why you took it.
Sure. I think it's actually culture, equality and inclusion. But that's fine. It covers everything you've said. It covers diversity as well. I have a long background in what we call EDI work, equality, diversity and inclusion work. Certainly as an activist in my student days and as an adult. And then professionally as a lawyer and latterly in working in higher education. And I suppose one of the things I've noticed is that over the years, EDI has become more complicated, more nuanced, and consequently more strategic in its approach and impact. And in that regard, more and more organizations and institutions, not just in the higher education sector, but certainly in the HE sector, have begun to recognize the need for strategic leadership in this area. And so Sussex has responded to the kind of evolution of EDI work over the years by creating this role very helpfully, in my view. And I was attracted to it because it's still one of a relatively few number of universities that has EDI as a distinctive and exclusive function of, not exclusive function, but a focus function of a PVC. It was attractive to me in that regard, but also because I've known of Sussex for many years. I like Sussex very much. I'm very impressed by so much of it, and it was and is a very appealing opportunity for me.
Okay, yeah, that's a very very useful summary. Then, what do you see as being some of the sort of specific reasons for the call for a strategic approach, like you say?
Well, I think in part there has been an evolving understanding, if you like, of the nature of underrepresentation and disadvantage. If you think about the first legislation, for example, in this country around equality, it was probably the Race Relations Act 1965. And that was what we would now consider to be a very narrow piece of legislation. It's sort of very basically recognized racism and only applied some prohibitions in a limited number of areas. But over the years, as societies have come to understand what I would say structural and systematic oppression faced by various groups of marginalized individuals. So we've begun to see that addressing it is much more than just about not behaving badly. but also about how systems and approaches and policies and practices and environments and cultures can exclude and disadvantage, even where there may not be the overt intention to do so. Obviously, there sometimes is the overt intention to do so, but even where there isn't that intention to disadvantage anyone, nonetheless, that might happen because of more systemic and structural arrangements. And as the understanding of that has evolved, so it has become more important to take, if you like, a more strategic and systematic approach to address it.
Okay, are there some key issues then that you've noticed so far at Sussex that you've perhaps begun to address?
I don't think the issues in Sussex are different from those anywhere else, to be honest. So if you look at, I mean, I would point to historic events which have helped us understand this. So you and colleagues and others may recall or have heard of the consequences of the awful murder of Stephen Lawrence back at the end of the last century. And following on from that, there was an investigation into the failings of the police inquiry, because with one or two exceptions, the perpetrators have effectively escaped justice. That's not completely the case, but it is partly the case. And so there was an investigation into what happened. Why were the police not able to identify and successfully prosecute the murderers in most instances? And the judge who was responsible for that investigation, Lord Macpherson, came up with what has now become a very famous phase of institutionalized racism. And that was an attempt to move away from just looking at who is behaving well and who is behaving badly, to how the whole culture of the police at the time was such that it militated against the effective investigation of the murder of a young black man. And so the importance of that was not only for the Metropolitan Police, which was who were the subject of the investigation, but also in growing understanding of how oppression and disadvantage arises, whether it's racism or sexism or homophobia or what I would call young adults oppression or ageism or disablism or any of the other ways in which people can be homophobia, transphobia, or any of the ways in which people can be marginalized because of their identity. And so I use that example because following on from that, and also the kind of evolving theoretical understanding of disadvantage, many organizations, including universities, begun to see that they needed to focus on their own arrangements in order to significantly address disadvantage. So in universities, for example, all of them, many if not all of them, have pay gaps, which means that the average pay of men and women, and sometimes black and minoritized ethnic staff as opposed to white staff, and sometimes disabled staff as opposed to non-disabled staff, is not the same, that there is a gap. Now, we need to be careful here. I'm not talking about two people doing the same job but being paid differently. I'm talking about the average pay across an organization. But that is indicative of things. That's indicative of the fact that you may not have you may have a degree of job segregation whereby, say, which is the case in Sussex, there are a lot of women in more junior roles and few of them in more senior roles. There may be good reasons behind that, but there's still a structural, also at least understandable reasons behind that. But there's a structural arrangement there which needs to be thought about. And so responses to things like that would be around encouraging pipelines, flexible working, ensuring that people who take time out because of caring responsibilities or to raise a family are not disadvantaged in their careers. Those are all structural arrangements which need to be thought about in order to address, in this case, the gender pay gap. Or in the case of students, as we know that there is an awarding gap. So the percentage of black and minoritized ethnic students who get a good degree, which is a first or a 2-1, is not as great as white students. Now, it's more complicated than that, especially when you fold in class and other considerations as well. But there are structural arrangements there to be thought about.
So, of course, your background is in law, particular in equality and inclusion. So this is something you have a lot of experience in. So can we now move on? Can I ask how some of these examples that you've given apply specifically in the realms of Sussex University?
Well, we like many or most, if not all, universities, we have an awarding gap and we have a pay gap. So we have work to do, which we're undertaking here in that regard. In a broader sense, evolving our culture, evolving our environment in a way which is as inclusive as possible for everybody makes a difference. It doesn't only make a difference to how people feel, it makes a difference to kind of hard data metrics like the awarding gap or pay gap. We also know, well, I'll give you an example. We know research shows us that one of the greatest levers for ameliorating and eliminating the awarding gap is where students have a real sense of belonging. And a sense of belonging is a hard thing to pin down, but creating an inclusive culture is definitely part of that. So we have work to do in Sussex on that. I would say I think Sussex in many ways does fantastically, and certainly anecdotally, since I've arrived, I've been overwhelmed by the strength of warmth and affection that the community has for the university and for their colleagues, staff and students. But nonetheless, there's always more work to do. There are challenges for us if you are a disabled person or a black or minoritized ethnic person or a trans or a gay or bisexual person or queer person, or there are still challenges, and some of those challenges are ones which extend beyond the university for sure. They're in the wider environment, but nonetheless, we as a community, we still have a responsibility to address it, even if it's bigger than just the university.
Oh, that's a very interesting metric to have found. That what was it? Was it the feeling included, feeling part of the community?
It's anecdotal. It's just from conversations I've had. But I've been very struck how even when people are cross or upset with the university for some reason or other, often they're very keen to stress that in terms of colleagues, people around them, they're very, very supportive of the environment in that way. So there are many, I suppose what I'm finding is that there are many strengths in the university to build on. But notwithstanding that, there's still work to be done, because we still have, I mean, in many ways, inclusion is a journey. It's not an endpoint. I'm not sure that we would know how to say we are now fully inclusive. I think we have to keep thinking and working towards understanding the experiences of all colleagues and staff, and continuing to work to ensure that our arrangements are as inclusive as possible.
Yeah, I suppose that's an interesting point too, that it's not really something that can ever be completed as a goal. It's an ongoing process that doesn't have a clear end to it.
I think so, and I think that's in part because identities evolve themselves. So the experience, I mean, I'm a disabled person, and I'm quite old now, but how I would have seen myself as a disabled boy and young man 40, 50 years ago is different from how I see myself as a disabled person now, because society has evolved, communities evolved and I have evolved as well. So there are kind of lots of moving parts in this process. Having said that, one can definitely make progress. I don't want it to sound as if it's so complicated that we can never know if we're doing well or badly. I think we can.
Interesting.
I think actually this is my view, and I know others may disagree, but the long view is that there is an upward trend. I think there are still challenges, but I think, and sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and occasionally it's 2 steps forward and 10 steps back. But over the long term, I think things are, there is a greater understanding of the nature of oppression now more than there used to be.
That's really promising. I think it does kind of echo in a kind of wider cultural, societal sort of change as well. That's perhaps a little difficult to articulate and measure. It's a lot of impressive work, and it's great that what you do has got such I guess an institutional backing and support now.
And I think, I mean, the university has made a commitment in this place. That doesn't mean that we'll always get it right. In fact, we won't. And it's my responsibility to pay attention to that, and along with the broader leadership and colleagues across the university to continue to work towards progress and towards, I suppose, yes, I will hold out a kind of as an inclusive environment as possible. I also I think it complements comprehensively the core functions of a university, which are teaching, learning, research, and knowledge exchange. I don't believe you can really thrive in any of those areas outside of a fully inclusive or as inclusive as possible environment.
Yeah, I agree. I'm hoping now we can talk a little bit about the Sussex 2025 strategic framework. So in that video, in the sort of public video available on that, there's the line that the university is disruptive by design. So do you think you can give an idea of what this phrase means, what it's perhaps referring to, how it's represented in the work that you and your colleagues do in other areas of the university?
Yeah, I mean it's very interesting strapline, really. I mean, obviously it precedes me, and it's a brave thing for a university to have as its ambition. Certainly one could interpret that as being quite challenging. And some have said, why is there an inherent value in being disruptive? And sometimes disruption is unhelpful. But I think, and this is very much my perspective, it may not be others, but I think what it's reaching for is the foundational understanding of Sussex when it was brought into existence 60 years ago, as being a new way of being a university. So at that time, new anyway, with a big focus on interdisciplinarity. So cross-cultural, cross-subject discipline fertilization, a breaking out of narrow, siloed ways of studying and researching. And in many ways, Sussex has done fantastically with its various research centres and approaches to learning and research, feeding off in a symbiotic way, both academic research and learning and kind of wider world thinking and development. I wouldn't say by any means that Sussex is the only university that does this, of course, but I think that it looks to me that that's been as part of its kind of foundational approach. And
we started a trend, perhaps.
Maybe other universities would say that they've done it as well, and I'm sure, but certainly that's what Sussex has been proud of. And in other ways too, it sort of reaches for the idea that we will consider alternative ways of doing things. We won't just go along with the crowd, or go along with a historical or a traditional approach if we find better or different ways of doing things, which will help us do what we want to do. From an EDI perspective, I see it as a recognition that the status quo isn't sufficient, and that we want to do more and we want to do better.
Yeah, it's a very, very admirable goal. I think particularly in the mind of students as well, where there is an international reputation for it being where new ideas are had, where you can imagine enormous protests happening, people jumping on top of cars, holding signs. It's students that do these things. So a university that is oriented around that ethos, that has that at its heart, is something that's very valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I should say, of course, that it doesn't mean that all kinds of disruption are okay.
Of course, yeah.
There are some disruptions which are problematic, but so it's not like everything. It's not it has to be contextualized and thought about.
Absolutely, yes, of course. It has to be kind of feeding into something bigger and helping the sort of the whole body to progress.
But you're right. I mean, I think there is something laudable about people who aren't satisfied with the way things are when they could be better, whether they're staff or students, and howsoever that might manifest. There's something understandable and right about trying to make things better.
Would you say this is something that is reflected throughout the management staff, senior management, throughout other academic staff? I mean, it's certainly the case with a lot of students in the Students' Union, but is it the case with colleagues as well?
Well, I can't speak for everybody, obviously, but certainly I've faced nothing but support and encouragement from all the staff I've come across, and in the leadership team. There has been very strong support for the work, for the ambition, for my role, for our endeavours. And of course, there will be differences of opinion around certain detail, as there are with any group of people, including whether you're a staff member or students, or between students and staff and so on. But as an ambition to build as inclusive a university as we can, I would say, well, I've certainly not come across any direct opposition, for sure.
Oh, brilliant! That's great news. Okay, so how has your role working on the staff at Sussex University differed from your previous roles? Because you've been looking at through your LinkedIn profile, you've been a consultant a few times. I haven't seen your full job history, but perhaps working in university is relatively new to you. I'm not sure.
Well, actually, I'll come on to that. I just want to one other thing about the last question, probably an important piece of context, which is that within the idea of progressing EDI, people will have different views about what that means. So there will be, I don't want to suggest that everybody either knows or understands or agrees on all of the processes. I would say there's universal support for the ambition, but of course what that means for each person may be different. And that's a good thing, because it's through the kind of didactic and sort of almost Socratic approach to kind of analysis and thinking and learning that we get to move forward. So in answer to your last question, yes, there is very strong support for the work and my role, and there is good and active, lively debate about what that means in practice.
I guess this comes hand in hand with everyone having their own unique experience.
And also their understanding about what their experience, their understanding of themselves and each other. I mean, there are very big, important questions involved in all of this work about the nature of human relationships and structures and societies. And it's not surprising that in one sense we're all grappling with that. To come to your latter question, Jethro, I've worked in universities or with universities for about 13 years now. So after I stopped being a lawyer, so first of all, I was an equality and education lawyer, actually, in private practice in a medium-sized law firm, and I was then the first director of legal policy at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is the government regulator in this space. But then I went into higher education, and I've been there ever since 2010, working first of all with running a sector agency to support the EDI in universities across Britain, in fact the United Kingdom, and then running a very small higher education provider, and now at Sussex. I love universities and higher education, partly because it values ideas and thinking, and it values ideas and thinking, and it's also contains within it the possibility of big change for the benefit for everybody, and enhancing the ambitions of students and supporting the ambitions and goals of staff and benefiting society and communities as well. So, I mean, it's almost what's not to like about it, really. So I find universities fascinating. They're very complex organizations, which itself is interesting. Sussex is not by any means the biggest university, but it's a community of just under 19,000 students, roughly 3,500 staff. That's a big community. That's a complex organization. And within that, there are opportunities to really understand and know about structures and systems and to try and make a difference. Of course, there are other sectors offer similar or different opportunities, and I've worked as a lawyer. I've represented individuals. I am a consultant to the Premier League, which is a completely different kind of organisation, probably the most popular sporting competition in the world. A whole different set of arrangements, but in some respects similar challenges. I've worked in many sectors, in business sectors, public sectors, voluntary organisations as well. And they are all different, and sometimes there are differences of scale and complexity, and sometimes there are differences of approach. And it is true, it's not, a university isn't the same as a corporate body, but there will be overlaps, and there will be differences and similarities, I suppose, is the short answer. For a long answer, then, I suppose. You mentioned that university is a big and complex organisation. Presumably, a law firm is a place where things will run very efficiently. I'm not necessarily saying the university will run inefficiently, but with a lot more working parts, a lot more different sorts of demands, many different departments, each with producing different things. It must be very different and a much kind of bigger, like you say, more complex organisation. Could you give an idea of what makes a university challenging? Perhaps even times that it's felt as though it's difficult to get things done in comparison with working in a law firm or working for the Premier League? Well, universities are, it's in the nature of universities as crucibles of discussion and debate that inevitably perhaps they can be more disputatious. Now that can be challenging, but it can also be a huge opportunity, because in dispute you get the possibility of creative learning and understanding. If I was, this is a kind of straw man analogy, but if I was to be given the opportunity of one organisation where everybody agreed with each other, I don't know if such a thing exists, but or at least where nobody disputed anything, and another organisation where there was a massive debate and even dispute, then I would certainly choose the latter over the former. but it does come with its challenges. So there is more of a requirement, I would say, in universities to consult and engage than there might be in some other organizations, for example. That's not necessarily a problem, but it makes things more complicated. And sometimes universities are not as agile, for example, in moving forward as other much more hierarchical, compliant organizations may be. For example, I'm sure there are many, many other ways in which universities are different.
Yes. Well, so then, compared with your previous university experience, and perhaps how does again Sussex compare? So is it easy to get what you want accomplished?
I don't know that I know the answer to that. I mean, so I ran something called Equality Challenge Unit for 8 years, and ECU was the UK higher education sector's equality and diversity policy and research agency. It's now part of Advance HE. It merged with 2 other organisations to form Advance HE, which now continues to do that work. But as ECU, my role as chief executive was to engage with vice chancellors and leaders from across the sector. So I had contact with many of them over the 8 years that I was there. And I don't know that there is a lot of people ask me who does it well and who does it badly, and there isn't any. There is no kind of poster child university that does it great. There is very good practice that some universities have kind of implemented, and others have followed. I would say that. So I'm afraid I can't give you an answer as to whether Sussex is good or bad in EDI work. I would say that Sussex is probably more lively than some when it comes to debating these issues.
Okay.
And like everything, that can be an opportunity as well as a challenge.
I think that's a very interesting one. I think from within just studying at a single university as a student, it can be difficult to know whether concerns that people bring up are representative of our university sticking out against others. Is our university doing particularly well in particular areas, but because there's a culture of finding issues, it's difficult to contextualize that across the country. So that there is this sense of wanting to improve things, but also not knowing where are the problems, what to consider a problem.
Well, what I would say is that the issues that Sussex are facing are not unique to Sussex at all. So whether it's issues of racism or homophobia or transphobia or sexism or underrepresentation in a variety of ways, lack of access, awarding gaps, feelings of marginalisation, none of those are exclusive to Sussex. Many, if not most, maybe all universities will have some version of that they're thinking about.
So perhaps
differently. I'm not suggesting everything is identical. It may play out differently, but the fundamental issues are, because they're structural. Are not different. Are there will be versions of them in virtually every institution, and not just universities either, in other organisations as well.
But perhaps you could give an idea of how you would address a specific problem. So, for example, someone brought up that there was particularly low staff diversity in an area of the university. How would you kind of produce a plan for that and address the problem?
Well, I'll give you an established example, which many universities are doing. So back in, I think, 2005, there were, if you looked at the demographics of the professoriate, so across the UK, there were clear disparities. There were many more male professors than female professors, and clear disparities in other areas as well, race, disability, and certainly race and disability. But if you looked at the disparities in the professoriate in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, maths, and medicine, the percentage of women professors at the time was considerably lower, even than the average across. Even I think at that time there was something like 25% of the professoriate were women. But if you looked at women in STEM, female professors in STEM at that time, it was much less than that. So a program was established, a systemic change program, which is called the Athena Swan Charter, to address that. And that's an instrument that pretty much all universities have now adopted, which requires each university to analyze its own demographics in that space, look at who is, what the staff profiles look like, and in a nutshell, develop an action plan to address it. Now, some of that might be long-term, they might be pipeline issues. At that time, it might have been work to encourage girls studying in schools to think about STEM subjects at A-level and then at university, so that you begin to improve the pipeline into STEM disciplines. That, by the way, has changed dramatically. There are now many, many more women coming through in maths, physics, engineering, IT, all science subjects, and then there's a range of other things, working arrangements, cultures, time off for caring responsibilities, whole ranges of things. Each university who would have signed up for the Athena Swan Charter were required to analyse in as much detail as possible how they were doing, what they were doing, and what they were going to do to achieve the ambition of eliminating that demographic deficit. And although it hasn't been eliminated, it has improved considerably. So if you look at the professoriate in STEM subjects now, there are far more women in percentage terms than there were. Not equal yet, so there's still more work to be done. In fact, Athena Swan has now been extended to cover all subject disciplines, not just STEM subjects, because the process was considered to be efficacious anyway for all subjects. But that would be an example. I'll give you one more, which is one that's close to my heart, which is universities as what's called public bodies. That's a particular legal concept, have a positive obligation to promote good relations. That's different from private organizations. We have to do more than private organizations. And I see that as a huge opportunity. So I'm looking at a range of initiatives in Sussex that we might do to support that, whether it's through developing listening skills for everybody. We're going to be introducing a religion and belief forum to kind of bring to the fore good relations between faith communities, individuals of no faith, and people with different philosophical beliefs like humanism, in ways which can address and ultimately eliminate conflict. And I think that that's tremendously exciting. I don't suggest that we will get it right, or I certainly won't get it right all the time. But I think it's an important challenge for us.
Could you talk a little more about that project? That sounds very interesting.
Well, the listening project, the allyship and listening project, is still being developed, so there's probably not a lot more I can say about that right now, but we will be informing the community of it as it evolves. The Religion and Belief Forum is something that I think that we'll be doing, because in looking at EDI work in the university when I arrived, there's a lot of good stuff going on, and there are fora for considering issues of racism, for considering issues of sexism and underrepresentation in that regard, the disadvantage faced by disabled people and LGBTQ+ people. But there wasn't, as far as I could tell, a specific forum for considering religion and belief, which is what's called a protected characteristic, an identity in laws. It's something that we have to have regard to and think about. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there weren't individuals and people doing great work. And there are, both academics, student societies, the chaplaincy, are all thinking about this. But I felt that it would be really helpful for us to have a fora for thinking about it, not so much in terms of, which is the right or wrong belief. In fact, that's not the point of it, but more about advancing good relations and eliminating disadvantage. And we haven't brought it together yet. It's still at an early stage, and we're in the process of doing that. And it will be for the forum to decide how it wants to take the work forward. But I think these vehicles for thinking about these things are very important, and they will raise difficulties, difficult and challenging subjects. Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, these are all issues which come up every now and then, or conflicts between groups which will come up. But in that way, we will, I hope, be better able to think about and move forward on in addressing them.
And this is part of the history of Sussex as well, is the sort of very progressive approach to religion and belief. The Meeting House is a very progressive building, and I know the lead chaplain there, who is both, I've interviewed him before actually, Chris McDermott. He's both an Anglican priest and a Zen Buddhist at the same time. So it's certainly kind of already embedded in the Sussex
exactly
background.
And he's very clear, as is the chaplaincy, that the Meeting House and the chaplaincy is for everybody. It isn't just for people of any particular faith. It's for any or no faith, but it's for the community.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a very, very interesting forward-thinking project. I'll be excited to hear more about that one as it progresses. So to kind of continue from that, are there some big wins that you've had so far?
I don't think so. I'm not sure that I could say that there have been. I don't. It's an interesting question, Jethro. I tend not to think about the work in kind of like that. I tend to think about it in incremental progress. So, I mean, maybe they are big wins, but a big win, for example, would be where we reduce and eliminate any of the gaps that I've talked about, or we find, or even more ephemeral than that, where we find ways of people who fundamentally don't agree with each other or are in conflict to come together, not necessarily to agree, that's not the goal, but to be able to agree to disagree, and where every individual's fundamental needs and rights are properly protected. I mean, actually, that is a huge win, but I don't see it as in it'll happen in one sort of overnight existential moment. I think it will be a series of hundreds of steps in that direction. And I think that Sussex is moving in that direction. There are still big challenges, but some of the metrics are going in the right direction. Not all of them. Some of them are going in the right direction. And there are still big conflicts and there are still big struggles. And it is my role to think about moving that forward, and then the community's role to kind of do what it can to address them. So I'm not sure that answered your question, but I tend not to think about big wins in that way, like, I'm afraid. But I also think it's too complicated for big wins.
But I think, what steering an enormous institution, I think the big wins is probably going to be quite a difficult thing to define, because everything you do is big. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions from students as well. So I asked, I reached out on Discord and asked some people what they wanted to ask. Someone asked, if you came back in 3 years, is there something you wish would have changed?
Well, this is going to sound very woolly. I'm sure a lot of how I talk about EDI can sound woolly, but I think I would see that the community will have been made good progress and had been successful if well, the metrics have been improved, so we will have significantly improved, if not eliminated, those gaps that I mentioned. That we continue to have a lively, disputatious, creative, collegiate learning and research environment where colleagues, staff, or students, no matter what their perspective, could contribute and feel able to contribute, and ultimately be able to respect each other, even if they fundamentally disagreed. I mean, I hold to this kind of precept that at heart, there's no fundamental conflict between any two humans. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there is no conflict. There are clear conflicts. And certainly some people can behave appallingly to other people. But when you strip away the constructs which result in which either result or allow oppression or disadvantage, and you look at the fundamentals of what it is to be human, then there isn't there's no reason for any two people to be in conflict with each other. The structural arrangements and systemic arrangements which have resulted in domination, oppression, disadvantage, of which one could talk about for days, weeks, years, months, and years. Those are the things that we need to unpick. I suppose another way of putting it is I don't see this work as a zero-sum game. I don't see that somebody's fundamental needs has to be denied in order for somebody else's fundamental needs to be met. So 3 years' time, or 5 years' time, or 10 years' time, we would have made progress in that goal.
Okay. Reducing the inequality, the gaps that you mentioned is quite a sort of central feature.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a regulatory obligation on universities as well. It's not just what I would like. So, thoroughgoing universities like Sussex and all the others have targets set by the Office for Students, the regulator, which requires them to make progress around reducing and eliminating gaps. Universities, like all large organizations, have to report their gender pay gap, and we have to make progress towards addressing it. So it's not just me, there are other drivers there. But I think metric, you can't measure everything. Can you measure everything? You can probably intimate what things are like, but some things are more, cultures are difficult to kind of pin down. So well, maybe you can measure everything, but you can't ascribe a number to everything. Not really. I mean, and so things like good relations don't lend themselves well to a metric. Maybe it's not true. I mean, I'd need to think more about that. Maybe you could sort of measure it in detail. But I suppose what I'm saying is I'm looking for qualitative as well as quantitative progress.
Yeah, and it's very, very inspiring what you're saying about people having sort of good intentions at heart, even if kind of many layers of experience, of prejudice, of however many things it could be, kind of getting in the way and building conflict. There is a kind of a desire to resolve.
Yeah, and I hope I don't sound Pollyanna-ish about this. People do behave badly. There's no doubt about that. Not just in Sussex, but in the world, as we see every day. And that needs to be stopped and addressed. But I see that as there's nothing. I suppose my own view, it's a personal view, is I don't think that I tend to find it's not helpful to think about good and bad people, but rather systems and arrangements which result in people behaving badly, or encouraging people to behave, or permitting them to behave badly. And some of that is very personal, to do with painful experiences that people have had, and some of it is to do with privilege and a whole range of complex arrangements. But as an organization, paying attention to those things is very important.
Nice. I suppose for every kind of traditionally recognized marginalized group that you can make progress towards supporting, there is going to be another group that as a result feels ignored, feels as though they should have had resources put in their direction. So do you find there's a lot of this?
I don't see that that's necessary. It may actually be that way, but I mean, this is, I suppose, what I mean by it not being a zero-sum game. So, for example, I don't think that in addressing historic sexism and misogyny, for example, I don't think that the real needs of men have to be denied. It may be that there are power shifts, for sure. It might be that, and there's lots of people who've written about privilege and the need to give up privilege, and people who've thought about and written about this far better than I have talked about it. But I suppose what I'm talking about is the real and fundamental needs of men don't have to be denied. It may be that our lives will look differently in a world without sexism and male domination and misogyny, but it's not. But that's the distinction I would make.
Very, very useful. That's very real food for thought. Thank you. So I've got one final question on my list, which is, how have your impressions changed since you've been here?
Well, I'll say again, really, I have found Sussex to be very warm, very friendly. A lovely environment in many ways, but also incredibly disputatious about some things. And I don't criticize that. Sometimes that those disputes have become very painful. And I suppose I've learned about that since I've been here. But I feel very optimistic about the future. I think that there is a well of goodwill and desire for good things amongst the community, staff and students, and it's a well that we can draw on in terms of the work going forward.
Well, that feels like a very good note to end on. Thank you very much. It's been great to pick your brain, to hear everything you have to say, hear about your experience, hear the words from a member of upper management as well. Is there anything you'd like to say to finish up?
I don't think so. It's been an interesting conversation. I'm sure there are things I may have said which I could have phrased better or more elegantly, and but I've enjoyed very much talking to you about this, and I hope it's been of some interest.
Yes, it certainly has. Thank you very much.